The cold came down on the night of January the 22nd, 1884, and by the second morning, the thermometer nailed to the lap barn read 26 degrees below zero. Wind came off the frozen length of Sugar Creek and drove the snow flat across the eastern Ohio hills and up and down the valley. Families woke to find their winter food ruined. Rebecca Lapp did not. She wrapped a wool shawl over her plain dress, lit a lantern, and walked 20 steps from her kitchen door to a low mound of earth built into the hillside. She lifted the outer door, stepped into a short passage of creekstone, pulled that door shut behind her, and only then opened the second one. 9 steps down, the wind simply stopped. The lantern showed a dry, still room dug deep into the ground, shelves along both walls, bins of sand along the floor, and the smell of apples and turned earth where the neighbors that morning smelled only rot and cold. A wooden thermometer on the center post read 39 degrees. It had read within 4 degrees of that number every day since October. Rebecca filled her apron with potatoes that were firm and pale, took down a crock of pickled beets, cut a wedge from a cabbage hard as a green stone, and gathered a dozen apples that still snapped when a child bit into them. Up and down the creek, her neighbors were lifting their cellar hatches to find potatoes frozen to black glass, squash gone to slime, and canning jars split open where the beans inside had frozen and swelled. 6 months earlier, the men of the settlement had stood at the edge of her digging and called it a grave, a widow burying her strength in a hole no sensible person needed. Now, it was the only full pantry left in the valley, and before that winter ended, it would feed more children than her own. Rebecca Lapp was 34 years old and had been a widow for 19 months. Her husband, Jacob, had died in the spring of 1882, killed by a hickory he was felling to clear the north field, when the trunk split wrong and dropped a limb across his back. He left her 160 acres only half cleared, a cabin of squared logs measuring 18 by 24 feet, an unfinished barn, and 3 children. Hannah, who was 11, grave beyond her years; Amos, who was 8, and Katie, who had just turned 5. He left her also 40 acres of standing corn, 2 milk cows, a team of horses, and $81 in a tin behind the stove. The Amish settlement along Sugar Creek was young, 11 families who had come west from Lancaster County to take up cheaper land, and it did what the people always did for a widow. The men brought in her corn that first fall. The women filled her shallow cellar with what they could spare, but charity has a season, and by the second winter, the settlement quietly expected Rebecca to do what widows were expected to do: marry a man who needed a wife, fold her land and her children into his household, and stop being a weight the community had to carry. Rebecca had other ideas, and the first was that she would not lose her children to a hungry winter the way she had watched a family lose 2 the year before. That family had been the Zooks, on the far side of the ridge, and Rebecca had stood at the graves of their 2 youngest in the March mud of 1883 and done the arithmetic no one else seemed willing to do. The Zooks had not lacked for food at harvest. They had stored it the way everyone stored it, for generations back east: potatoes and turnips in a shallow board cellar under the cabin floor, cabbages and squash in the loft, apples in the lean-to, crocks and jars on a shelf by the hearth. It had always been enough in Pennsylvania, but the winters out here swung from thaw to killing cold and back within a single week, and that swing was the thing that destroyed food. A warm stretch had softened and sprouted the Zook potatoes in December. The hard freeze that followed turned what remained to black slime. By February, they were boiling corn and little else, and the 2 smallest sickened and died before the roads opened, not from any one thing a doctor could name, but from a whole winter of too little food in bodies too small to spare any. The problem was not that the people lacked food, it was that they couldn't keep it. And keeping it, she decided, wasn't a problem of how hard you worked in summer. It was a problem of where you put the food when the work was done. The idea came to her in April, when she went into her own shallow cellar for seed potatoes and found half of them soft and eyed with sprouts. The cellar under her cabin was 3 feet deep, no more, dug down to where a man stopped because the ground grew hard. In summer, it went warm and close. In the deep of winter, the cold reached into it through the floorboards above and the thin skin of earth around its walls. It was barely underground at all. The dirt its walls touched was the same dirt that froze solid in the January field. What she needed was not a better cellar of the old kind. It was a room that lived where the winter could not follow. Rebecca had grown up outside Lancaster, where her grandfather kept a spring house dug into a bank, cool as a cave in August, and she remembered a thing the old man used to say, that 4 feet down, the earth forgot the season. She had no science for it, but she had watched it prove itself her whole life. Deep in the ground, past the reach of the frost, the earth held a steady coolness through the hottest August, and a gentle mildness through the coldest January. It did not swing. If she could build a room down there, deep enough, and keep the outside air from rushing in and out, her food would sit at one even temperature from harvest, clear to spring. Cold enough that nothing rotted, warm enough that nothing froze. The whole trick was depth and stillness. Everything after that was detail. She made the mistake of mentioning it after the preaching service in May, and by that evening, Bishop Samuel Byler had come to her door. He was 58, had led the Sugar Creek congregation since its founding, and carried the quiet, immovable weight of a man whose word settled questions. He sat at her table, turned his black hat slowly in his hands, and spoke gently, which was harder to bear than if he had shouted. "Rebecca," he said, "I have buried people who trusted their own cleverness over the ways the people have kept for 200 years, and I do not care to bury more. We store our food as our fathers stored it, and the Lord has seen us through. When I hear a widow means to spend her one strong summer digging a pit in a hillside instead of tending her fields, it troubles me. Pride wears many coats. Sometimes it wears the coat of a better idea." He set the hat on the table. "You have 3 children and no husband. Dig your garden. Dig a grave for no one, and pray honestly on whether the Lord has not already set a simpler answer in front of you than a hole in the ground." The simpler answer, everyone understood, was a widower, 2 farms down with a sound barn, and a need for a wife. Rebecca thanked the bishop, walked him to her door, and agreed to nothing. But his words stayed with her through the night, because they weren't foolish. She was gambling her one summer of strength on an idea she couldn't yet prove. If she was wrong, she would go into winter with her fields half-tended and her food kept no better than anyone's, and no time left to set it right. Mary Yoder heard about the plan at a quilting the following week, and Mary had no patience for gentleness. She was 61, had raised 9 children, and buried a husband, and put up food for 40 winters, without once losing a family to hunger. And she cornered Rebecca over the frame with her needle going the whole time. "I have kept potatoes in a board cellar since before your mother married," she said, driving the needle down and up. "Cabbages in the loft, apples in straw, beans in the crock. It has always been enough. What you are talking of is more digging than 2 grown men could manage in a summer, and you are one woman with a widow's back and a hoe. You will break yourself on it, and have nothing to show but a wet hole and a wasted year. Put up your food the way your mother did, and stop trying to be clever. Clever does not fill a child's stomach in February." There was truth in it, and Rebecca felt the sting of the truth more than the scorn. Mary had kept her own family fed for 40 years, a longer proof than anything Rebecca could set against it. And the labor was real. She had measured it in her mind at night, and it frightened her. But Mary had also lost a granddaughter 2 winters back, one of the Zook children, and had stored her food that year exactly as she always had. Enough, Rebecca thought, was a word people leaned on right up until the winter had failed them. She said only, "Denki, Mary," and kept her needle moving. Her brother-in-law came the hardest. Eli Lapp was 38, Jacob's younger brother, and he had taken it upon himself to watch over his dead brother's family with a mixture of duty and impatience. He found her in June, out behind the cabin, pacing off the south face of the hill with a knotted string. "You should be cutting wood," he said flatly. "You will need 6 cords at the least, and you have not one split. You should be hoeing your corn. Instead, you are out here measuring dirt, like a man laying out a barn." He rubbed the back of his neck the way Jacob used to. "This is foolishness, Rebecca. If you must keep your food better than the rest, let the families keep it for you. Spread among us. That is what the people are for. You do not need to bury it like a squirrel hiding acorns. And if the truth is that you cannot manage this farm alone, then there is a good man who would have you, and no shame in it." His concern was honest, and his arithmetic was not wrong, and that was what made him hard to answer. She had no wood. Her corn needed her. Every hour in that hole was stolen from work that also had to be done, and there was only one of her. But spreading her food among 11 families that all stored it the same failing way was no answer. It only meant her share would rot in someone else's loft instead of her own. And she had stood at the graves of 2 children who died because the whole valley trusted a single broken method. She told Eli she would cut her wood. She did not tell him she meant to do both on 4 hours of sleep, because she could see no other road that did not run through another man's kitchen. If these accounts of hard-won frontier wisdom mean something to you, the quiet, practical genius that kept ordinary families alive when the cold came down and no one was coming to help, take a moment to press the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who ought to hear them. Rebecca broke ground on the 15th of June, cutting into the south face of the low hill, and every choice she made in that hole was bent toward one end, setting the floor of her storeroom deep enough that the frost could never reach it. In eastern Ohio, the ground froze down about 3 feet in a hard winter. She dug her floor to 9. 6 full feet of solid, undisturbed earth would stand between the deepest reach of the frost and the food she meant to keep. And that earth held near 50 degrees the year around, never freezing, never warming, a great cool mass that changed its mind about temperature only across months, never days. That mass was why her thermometer would hold so steady. A cold snap could rage for a week above ground and barely stir the deep earth a single degree. But depth alone was not the whole answer. And here, Rebecca's real understanding showed. A sealed hole would sweat. Warm, damp air rising off stored vegetables would meet the cool walls, turn to water, and drip back down as rot onto everything below. So she built the room to breathe. She set one wooden pipe that opened low, near the floor, and ran up through the roof to draw cool outside air down along the ground. She set a second that opened high, near the ceiling, to let the warm, moisture-heavy air rise and escape. The two together made a slow current, cold air sinking in, spent air rising out, that carried the dampness away before it could gather and drip. And that same current gave her a hand on the temperature. On a cold, dry night, she opened both pipes and let the winter air pull the room toward the high 30s. When the air outside turned deadly, she shut them and let the 6 feet of earth hold the room alone. She could tune it, colder or milder, the way another woman tuned a stove, damper, with nothing but 2 pipes and the plain fact that cold air falls. And she did not stop there. She hung not 1 door, but 2. An outer door flush with the hillside, and an inner door 9 steps down, with a short stone passage between. That passage was an airlock, though she never called it that. On a bitter day, she shut the outer door before she opened the inner one, so the storeroom never took a blast of the killing cold. She lined the walls with creek stone, both to hold back the earth and to add more mass to hold the even temperature. She graded the floor so any water that seeped would run to a stone-filled sump in the low corner and drain away instead of pooling. And she buried her potatoes and carrots and beets, each separated in dry creek sand, no root touching its neighbor, the sand holding just enough moisture that they would not shrivel and keeping any one rotten root from spreading its ruin to the rest. None of it was magic. It was the same small handful of plain facts, applied without flinching. The earth below the frost forgets the season. Moving air carries off the wet that breeds rot. 2 doors keep the cold from rushing a room, and a thing held steady at 38 degrees will neither freeze nor spoil across half a year. She had only watched the world carefully and refused, flatly, to store her children's food in a place the winter could walk into. The digging alone nearly finished her. She worked it in the gray hour before the children woke, and in the long light after supper, a thin woman with a mattock and a stone boat, the horses dragged out loaded with spoil. Hannah minded Katie and kept the cook fire. Amos hauled stone up from the creek in a child's endless trips. The clay came out in heavy wet slabs that first month, until she struck a seam of clean sand that lightened the labor and later filled every one of her bins, which she took as a mercy from Providence and said so aloud, alone, in the dark of the pit. By the middle of July, she had a chamber 8 feet wide and 10 feet long and just tall enough to stand in, its floor 9 feet below the crown of the hill. Then came the harder question of holding the roof up. She could pour no ceiling and had no money for milled lumber, so she made the land furnish the answer. She cut and squared heavy oak beams from her own woodlot, set them close across the span, laid a tight floor of split poles over them, and heaped 2 full feet of earth on top, the earth being not only free but the very insulation she wanted, more mass to keep the season out. Levi King rode by while she was up on the beams and stopped his horse to watch. Levi King was 45, had dug more wells and cellars than any man in the settlement, and was the one skeptic whose warning Rebecca could not wave off. He climbed down and stood a long while looking into the hole. "Deep," he said at last. "Deeper than I would have gone." He crouched at the raw lip. "You have thought about the water? This ground holds water in the spring thaw. If your floor sits below where the water rises, come April, you have not built a cellar. You have built a cistern, and everything in it will float up and rot in a single night. I have watched it happen to better built holes than this." He straightened and brushed his knees. "You have put every bit of it into one basket and buried the basket. If the water comes up, you lose the whole winter all at once, and there is no getting a mouthful of it back." It was the truest thing anyone had said to her all summer, and it kept her awake 3 nights. If she had misjudged the spring water table, she had not built a pantry but a trap that would swallow her family's whole winter in one flood. She spent 2 days she could not spare digging test holes down the slope and watching them drain after the rain, and found, to her relief, that the South Hill shed its water hard and fast, and the seep ran a good 2 feet below her floor. But she answered the warning anyway. She cut a drainage trench along the uphill side to turn the surface water away, dug her sump a foot deeper, and lined it with stone. A good warning, she had come to think, was worth more than 100 good wishes, even from a man who plainly expected you to fail. She hung the 2 doors in September and hauled the last of the stone while her corn dried in the shock. She was thinner than she had ever been. Hannah had learned to take in seams rather than let them out. She had cut only 3 cords against the 6 she needed, and that deficit frightened her worse than she let the children see. But when she stood in the finished room in the first week of October, with the noon sun blazing at 70 on the hillside outside, and read 39 degrees on the thermometer nailed to the center post, she knew, the way a person knows a thing in the bone before they can prove it, that the old earth had kept its old promise. 4 feet down, it forgot the season. She had gone more than twice that deep. She filled the room through October with everything the season gave. 20 bushels of potatoes bedded in the dry sand, carrots and beets, and turnips each in their bins, 40 heads of cabbage hung by their roots from the beams, squash on the high dry shelf, 6 barrels of apples, crocks of pickled beans and sauerkraut, and better than 200 glass jars of what she and the children had put up through the summer. She closed the inner door on the fullest pantry in the valley, prayed over it in the lantern light, and went out to face a winter with too little wood and everything still to prove. The winter of 1883 to 1884 came in crooked, exactly the way the frontier winters did, and it was that crookedness that killed the settlement's food. December ran warm, a long, treacherous false spring set down in the dead middle of the year, rain instead of snow, and the ground never freezing hard. In the cabins and lofts and shallow board cellars up and down Sugar Creek, that misplaced warmth went quietly to work. Potatoes stored 3 feet down felt the mildness and began to sprout, pushing pale shoots into the dark and going soft as they spent themselves. Cabbages in the warm lofts loosened and rotted from the core outward. Apples in the lean-tos went soft and brown. The families saw it and told one another it was only a bad patch, that the honest cold would come and set it right. The cold set nothing right. It came on the 22nd of January, an Arctic wind that dropped the valley from a thaw to 26 below in a day and a half and held it there for the better part of 2 weeks. Whatever the warm December had spared, the freeze came for. The shallow cellars, only 3 feet down and already chilled through by weeks of mild, wet weather, gave the frost a straight road to their floors, and the potatoes that had not rotted now froze solid through their hearts, so that when they thawed, they went black and sweet and slick and fit for nothing but the hog trough. Canning jars along cold cabin walls froze in the night, and the water in them swelled to ice and burst the glass on the shelves. The warm had rotted what the cold now finished. By the first week of February, a settlement that had crossed half a continent to farm good land was staring at empty shelves with 2 full months of hard winter still to run. Rebecca's room did not so much as flinch. 9 feet down, behind 6 feet of undisturbed earth and 2 feet of packed roof and 2 shut doors, the December warmth had never reached it, and the January cold could not. Across the whole wild swing of that winter, the thermometer on her center post moved a total of 4 degrees, from 41 in the mild weeks down to 37 in the deepest of the freeze, and it never once crossed either of the 2 lines that mattered, never up to where a thing spoils, never down to where a thing freezes. On the coldest night, Rebecca shut the pipes tight against the killing air, let the great cool earth hold the room alone, and went down through her airlock to bring up potatoes as firm as the day she bedded them in sand. Her children ate their fill. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. It was the young Kings who brought the winter to Rebecca's door in the flesh. Levi King's son had married the spring before and taken a poor claim up the North Branch, and by the middle of February, their food was gone, rotted and frozen with all the rest. Their baby 3 months old, and the mother's milk failing on boiled corn. Levi came himself, on snowshoes, too proud at first to say plainly why, and Rebecca did not make him say it. She took him down the 9 steps and filled 2 grain sacks, potatoes and carrots, a cabbage, a crock of beets, jars of tomatoes, and beans that had never known a frost. "For the young ones," she said, and Levi King, who had warned her the water would drown the whole scheme, stood among the full bins with his hat in his hands and could not for a moment find his voice. After that, they came without so much shame in it, one family and then another, and Rebecca weighed out from her bins to any child in the valley going hungry, and the room the men had called a grave gave up its stores all that black February and never once ran dry. She had built it to feed 3 children. It fed a good many more. The valley learned the rest slowly, the way the people learned everything, a word at the mill, a word after the preaching. Eli came around in the 2nd week of February because he had run short himself, and because he was still, underneath the impatience, a man who loved his brother's children. He stood in her warm kitchen, looked at the full crock on the table and the good color in the children's faces, and Rebecca only took him down the 9 steps and showed him the room, the bins still deep in sound potatoes, the apples still snapping, the 200 jars whole and bright on the stone shelves. He was quiet a long time in the lantern light. "I told you to spread it out among us," he said finally. "If you had done as I said, it would all be gone now, rotted and froze along with ours. You kept it because you kept it apart, and because you kept it deep." He looked at her straight. "I was wrong, Rebecca. I do not like to say the words, but I was wrong, and Jacob would be proud of what you have done here, and I have been a poor brother to have said him less." She sent him home that evening with a sack of potatoes and a crock of beets for his own table, and that was how it went. Word ran up and down the creek that the widow Lapp had a full cellar in a starving winter, and one by one the settlement came, not to mock, but to measure. Levi King came again and studied the drainage trench and the stone sump and the 2 breathing pipes, and nodded slowly at everyone, a well-digger reading another's good work. Mary Yoder came and stood in the cold, even room a long while, and said at last only, "40 winters, and I never once went deep enough," which from Mary Yoder was a whole sermon. And Bishop Samuel Baylor came last of all, and looked a long time at the room he himself had named a grave, and was honest enough to bow his gray head. "The Lord gives out his wisdom where he will," he said quietly, "and I was far too sure I knew the shape of it. You have fed children this winter that I could not. That is not pride, Rebecca. That is a gift, and the people will be thankful for it, and so am I." And Rebecca, who had carried the bishop's gentle disapproval all summer, like a stone in her apron, felt the stone at last set down. Stories like Rebecca's, the overlooked practical genius that carried ordinary families through winters that should by every right have broken them, are the reason this channel exists. If you would like to help keep this kind of hard-won frontier wisdom from being forgotten, subscribe and follow along. Every account we tell is one more piece of vanished knowledge, saved for the people who still need to understand what real resilience looked like. What Rebecca Lapp had built was not a new thing under the sun, though she had worked it out alone with a mattock and her grandfather's remembered words. Peoples in cold country the world over had come up against the same problem and answered it nearly the same way. The old farmers of England and Ireland banked their potatoes in earth-covered clamps. The Russians dug cellars deep beneath the frost to hold cabbage and beets through winters far crueler than Ohio ever saw. The root cellars of New England, the earth-sheltered stores of the Old Norse, the pit granaries of far older peoples still, were every one of them the same small handful of truths, found and lost, and found again, because the underlying problem never changed. Food is only life stored against a hungry season, and the earth, if a person will go deep enough and then let the room breathe, will keep that life better than any wall raised above the ground. The frost has a bottom to it, and below that bottom, the whole turning year holds still. People discovered that on 3 separate continents, because the cold asked every one of them the same question, and the patient ground gave back the same honest answer to anyone willing to dig deep enough to hear it. By the harvest of 1884, there were 4 deep earth cellars dug into the hills along Sugar Creek, everyone built to Rebecca's plan. A floor below the frost, walls of creek stone, 2 breathing pipes, and 2 doors with a passage between. By 1887, there was scarcely a farm in the settlement without one, and the young families who married in and built new never thought to store their food any other way. To them, it had always been done so. Rebecca Lapp never remarried. She raised her 3 children on that half-cleared farm, and when Hannah married a miller boy from the next valley, she dug a deep cellar of her own and taught her husband the way of the pipes and the 2 doors exactly as her mother had taught her. Eli built one himself that first year, and was ever after the loudest man in the settlement to say aloud whose idea it had been. Rebecca lived to be 79 and died in the spring of 1929, and the young people at her funeral knew her only as a quiet old woman who kept a fine garden, with no notion that the cool, even rooms beneath half the hills in their valley had come out of one hard summer's digging by a widow they had once told, gently and firmly, to go and remarry. The knowledge had done the very thing good knowledge does when it is true. It had become so ordinary that everyone forgot it ever had to be one. The men of the settlement had stood at the edge of Rebecca Lapp's digging in the summer of 1883 and called it a grave, a foolish widow burying her one summer's strength in a hole. They were wrong in about the deepest way a person can be wrong. She had not been burying anything. She had been reaching down, past the frost, to the one still place the winter could never follow her into, and she had brought her whole family, and half the valley's children besides, through a year that starved the settlement, by trusting a thing far older and far steadier than any tradition men could argue over, that the earth keeps its quiet promises to those who dig deep enough to hold it to them. They laughed at the hole in her hillside, right up until their own shelves went bare. After that, they stopped their laughing, and they picked up their shovels, and they began, at last, to dig.